Great, and I will pass it over to Meg and Richard.
Hello, everyone. Bear with me just a moment while I remember how Zoom works as a host. No matter how many times I use it, I always have to take another look at it. Richard, I'm going to have you share your screen.
One moment, it didn't like that. Let me try again. There we are.
Excellent. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat as Richard goes through his talk tonight, Trees and Communication. If you missed our previous talk, we are Maryland Sustainable Ecologies. Richard is a board-certified master arborist, which is kind of a big deal. There are fewer than 800 of them in the world. I am an ISA certified arborist as well, and we work to promote tree education in the state of Maryland, most notably in the area surrounding Washington, DC, and the suburbs. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Richard to start his talk. Please feel free to list some questions in the chat. I will try and answer them as we go along, but then we will also open it up at the end to have more discussion.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Again, my name is Richard Jones. Tonight, we're going to be talking about trees and communication. We'll be talking a little bit about some of the research that has gone into this, some of the implications, as well as some of the important people involved in the research. To start, I want to begin with a little bit of caution. Arbor culture, I'm an arborist. Silviculture, which is the study of forests and forestry. They're relatively new in terms of research, not in terms of practical application, but really intensive research into forestry and arboriculture. You're really looking in the last 30 to 50 years. And so things that I learned maybe 10 years ago have been found to not be true as additional research comes out. It's sort of the exciting thing about the cutting edge nature of this research, is that there's always something new coming out. You know, we hope that research can be duplicated by other labs and therefore, strengthened. But I'd just like to point that out in terms of the research itself. You know, in a few years, we may hear something different, and we'll just roll with that. The other thing I'd like to point out is that it can be kind of easy to anthropomorphize trees. And we're focusing here on communication and not really consciousness. And there's my little copyright violation from Avatar there in the corner. And so again, we're focused on communication, what that means to you, what that means in terms of trees. And the fundamental question that I'm going to pose to the audience here is, do you consider what we go over to be communication? Some scientists do and some don't. And as I said, the research is ongoing. I always like to start with a dictionary definition. So what is communication according to the people at Merriam-Webster? They say a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. Now, does that cover everything? Is that a good enough definition for what we're looking at? Does it need to be sort of a flexible definition? But generally, we can understand that communication is a codifying stage, some concept or idea, or some sort of information that I'm sending to you by way of talking or symbols or hand movements. But again, maybe it needs to be a bit more flexible when we're talking about communication among trees. So keep that in mind as we go along. A lot of what you're going to hear in this talk is about mycorrhizae, and so I'd like to go over what that is to give you a good base knowledge of it. Mycorrhizae is fungus. Normally we are involved with fungus when we see mushrooms. Those are the reproductive organs of the fungus. We call them fruiting bodies. So mycorrhizae is a fungus that has a symbiotic or occasionally parasitic relationship with a plant. They're not all symbiotic, they are occasionally parasitic. In this, when it is a symbiotic relationship, the mycorrhizae actually inoculates, or you could even say infects, the root system of the plant. And by attaching the mycelium to the root system, it actually can provide benefits to the plant. Some of those benefits include being able to penetrate deeper into the soil, being able to extend out further from the existing root system, and also an incredible increase in density. When we talk about this mycelium underground, it is so dense that there are miles of it in a square foot. It is really amazing. And again, what that does is the tree root is inoculated with this, and the fungus actually helps the tree root to uptake additional nutrients and water. The flip side of that is that the tree, as it goes through photosynthesis, will send sugars back down into the fungus. So they both benefit. On the left is a Lacinum fungus, very common mycorrhizal fungus, and on the right is sort of a diagram showing you what's going on at a microscopic level. There are certain mycorrhizae fungus that are specific to one genus of plants, but what we are interested in is the ones who are more of a generalist, the ones who do not focus on only one species or genus of plant. So again, that gives you sort of a basic idea of what mycorrhizae are, and we tend to call this a mycorrhizal system. So again, that's what we're talking about. We're going to primarily focus on what's called ectomycorrhizae. There are many different types. Ectomycorrhizae is specifically what we normally find in woody plants, trees, shrubs, roses, etc. There are other types. There's endomycorrhizae, and there's mycorrhizae that is specific to orchids. Most orchids actually need this relationship in order to have their seeds germinate. They need the mycorrhizae because the orchid seed doesn't have enough energy reserves on its own to germinate. It actually needs this fungus. But again, we're going to focus on the ectomycorrhizae specific to woody plants and therefore trees. Mycorrhizal fungi are generally not present in heavily disturbed urban soils, and that's very important when everything we're going over. You want to remember that if you have a site, an area that's been cleared, that's been regraded, that's had topsoil brought in, or had compaction, any of these events, that disturbs the soil enough that mycorrhizal system may not be there anymore. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Generally in our urban soils, it's a much, much lower amount of fungus in the soil. And that may have implications for tree care and, understanding the overall ecologies of these built environments that we have. Now, there are inoculants available on the market to us. There are many different formulations. This is the most common one I see. If you've ever been on a reforestation or afforestation community volunteering project, along with your shovel and your tree, you may have been given one of these little packets. These are intended as inoculants, spores of the mycorrhizal fungus that we're trying to incorporate into the soil. As I said, in a heavily built environment, it's not as present. So normally you're told, oh, sprinkle this around the base of the tree as you're planting it, try and incorporate it into the soil. How effective is this? Well, that's something we're still researching. I mean, you know, if you had this bucket full of inoculant and you left it in a shed for a year or left it outside, I mean, can you expect that what is in there is still alive after that time? Another thing we have to keep in mind is, you know, what is the natural native mycorrhizal fungus in the ecology you're in? And are you possibly introducing something that isn't normally part of that? Are you introducing an invasive species? You know, and that could lead to biodiversity issues. So, you know, we generally, a lot of tree care, plant health care formulations will include a mycorrhizal inoculant in it. The thinking being, well, every little bit helps, but we're still looking into this. So now I'd like to talk about what root grafts are. Root grafts are most common among species of the same tree. On the left is a root graft. Just like branches in a tree, if they touch one another, can eventually fuse. Roots in a tree will do the same thing. If two root systems from the same species of tree grow near one another, they may eventually fuse together, and then you have what's called a graft. In plant healthcare, that can occasionally be beneficial, and sometimes that can be an issue. On the right is a photo of an American elm that has Dutch elm disease, and that's why it's dying back so much. Well, Dutch elm disease is unfortunately transmitted by way of root grafts, but it is a fairly common thing that are among, you know, trees of the same species. You know, and you would expect in that situation that maybe some water or nutrients are shared. That doesn't come as too much of a surprise. So that's a fairly common thing among trees. You know, and you can get to the point where you have, and I may have mentioned this in our last talk, these clonal systems of trees, like this is Pondo. Pondo is a stand of quaking aspen at Fish Lake National Forest. Well, every one of these trees is a genetic clone of one another. All of their root systems, you know, have grafted onto one another. This is honestly one giant organism. To give you an idea how big Pondo is, that's how big it is. It's, you know, acres of trees, but they're all genetic clones of one another. And again, they have that shared root system. So that I think makes sense to us, that you could expect some sharing of nutrients and water in that situation. So sort of one of the leaders in this research is Dr. Suzanne Simard. She's out of British Columbia. She studied at Oregon State, I believe, but currently does her research in Canada and British Columbia. She is sort of the originator of this concept of the wood wide web, which you may have heard of before. I think it was around 1997, 1999, where people started talking about that. And her research also focuses on the concept of hub trees or mother trees. And again, she is sort of one of the big originators in this research. And she actually has a book coming out this year, Finding the Mother Tree. So let's talk a little bit about her research. It goes back more than 30 years. She was trained in forestry, and she works with a number of other foresters as well. That's Dr. Simard on the left in 1980. Sort of at the beginning of this research, and Jean Roach, who's another forester, in 1987. They have partnered for some time. And what they were looking at was the relationships in a forest among trees. One of the main things we're sort of taught is that trees compete with one another, and, you know, whichever one gets to the sunlight first wins, and if they can shade out all the rest of the competition, they're doing great. You know, a lot of nature documentaries built that up as well. But Dr. Simard had this idea of, well, maybe it's not so competitive. Maybe it's actually mutually beneficial. This is, again, a diagram of what a mycorrhizal system would look like. Now, you may remember I said certain ones are generalists. They will inoculate or infect different species of tree. So you can kind of see, now tree root systems don't go that deep, of course, but, you know, for artistic sake that's in there. But to give you a visual of how a mycorrhizal fungus can actually be connecting two trees, not necessarily through a root graft, but through the mycelium. And this can be over long distances. I also like that on the left, they are pointing out that there are fungus that are saprophytes. That is, they're not mycorrhizal. They are actually, you know, feeding on decaying litter or decaying wood. And you'll notice at the bottom here, there are little arrows showing carbon going back and forth. This is sort of the crux of what her research was. Dr. Simard was able to track the flow of carbon from one tree to another. And again, you would expect within the same species, okay, maybe they help each other out. But they were finding that carbon was moving from pines into spruce or into birch trees. Really, these relationships you wouldn't expect to happen. And then it sort of began this idea of, well, are they helping one another out? Are they signaling to one another that they need help? And saying, oh, okay, yes, here, have some carbon this time of year. Maybe you're a deciduous tree that doesn't have its leaves right now, so take some of my carbon, and then when you're in full leaf, you know, then I'll take some as well. And again, as I said, this research has been going on for above 30 years. They began to note not only carbon, but also other nutrients, water, and defensive chemicals were moving between the trees. And that's, you know, incredible that, you know, different species of trees were having this relationship. You may have seen one of her TED Talks before. Dr. Simard has a few online. I would recommend you take a look at one of them. She goes into a little more depth of the methods of the research, you know, and the differences between conducting research in a lab and out in a forest. And they're, you know, they're fascinating to watch. I think this main one is maybe only about 18 minutes, but it's a great first step in understanding this research. Over time, the partnerships that they built, the research, all began to form what's called the Mother Tree Project. And the Mother Tree Project is the culmination of much of this research, being out in the field, and the results that they've found. One of the exciting things that Dr. Simard and the other researchers found was that certain trees were linked through the mycorrhizal network much more than any other tree in the area. And they started to refer to these as hub trees or mother trees. And if you look at this diagram, this is from one of their research projects. All of those lines connecting the trees are links in the mycorrhizal network. So the ones that are the most connected sort of began to be called these mother trees. Now you'll also notice there are tiny little dots there as well. Well, those are actually saplings that are growing in the shade of that mother tree. And Dr. Simard found in the research that the mother tree was actually sending carbon and water and perhaps these blueprints of defensive chemicals into the saplings, sort of shepherding them along. And this has some interesting implications in terms of forestry. If you have these hub trees that are really helping the rest of the system, you know, move carbon or deal with external stresses, you know, if there was some cutting for logging operations, things like that. Really fascinating stuff. All of their, if you'd like to read any of their, you know, research results, any articles, anything like that, it is at mothertreeproject.org. I'm not going to go too much into the nitty-gritty of their methodology. We don't really have time for that, but I encourage you to take a look at that. It gives you a nice timeline of the work that they've done and how they've, you know, come up with these results. A little random aside, there's a work of fiction called The Overstory by Richard Powers, and he sort of was inspired by Dr. Simard's research, and he wrote a novel about it where, this researcher was saying trees are helping one another, not competing, and, was eventually vindicated in that. It's a work of fiction, but it's an interesting little aside to this. I'd also like to talk about Meg Lowman, sometimes referred to as Canopy Meg. Meg Lowman is an author, a speaker, and arborist who really has tried to encourage this idea of the forest canopy and ecology as one unit, and to not look at these individual trees, but really look at their relationship. And this is sort of linked up with Dr. Simard's research. I also recommend taking a look at some of her speeches, and she has a number of books as well. But again, it's that moving away from this idea of everything is trying to outcompete each other in the forest, and all they're trying to do is grow over one another, when in fact maybe there's something more subtle going on there. Now, one thing I would like to talk about is, we're talking about sharing carbon among trees. We've been touching on that a lot. The research was involved with that. How do they physically know if carbon has moved from one tree to another? There are actually methods of doing that. Some researchers in Switzerland, this is probably, without knowing what's going on, this is a little bit of an upsetting photograph, seeing a giant tower crane in the middle of the forest. What the researchers did in an attempt to replicate Dr. Simard's research was they set up a tower crane and they exposed a certain amount of trees to carbon-13. Carbon-13 is a form of carbon that is heavier than what's naturally in the air, in carbon dioxide. So it can be tracked. You can differentiate between carbon-13 and what's in the air. Dr. Simard's research also used carbon-14, which is radioactive. That would allow them to track the carbon-14 with a Geiger counter. But again, these Swiss researchers were only using carbon-13, and they were applying it only to spruce trees in a given area. And what they found, they were Norway spruce, they found that the carbon-13, which they could track, was moving from the spruce trees, not only amongst themselves, but also to different species of tree, pine trees in this area. Again, reinforcing that, well, they're not the same species, but they still have an interaction that's beyond just competitiveness. What are they doing under there? Are they communicating and saying, hey, our area of the forest has had some fire damage, or we don't have as many nutrients. Can you send us some of yours? Maybe we have an issue with pine bark beetles in this area, teach us how to make the defensive compounds, or let us know that they're coming. Again, really fascinating to see this among different species of trees. And it does make you question, okay, well, what could be the evolutionary reason for this? And I encourage you to think about that as well. Why would a spruce tree be wanting to help out a pine tree? Is it simply, oh, well, it's a mutually beneficial system that they can send carbon to one another? Or is it a more overall system level approach of keeping the forest intact as a unit? But again, I'm not going to give you the answer to that. I encourage you to think about it on your own. It does, again, as I said, it's this counterpoint from what we've been taught of, everything is competing with one another, fighting with one another. Any David Attenborough, documentary about the Amazon rainforest is constantly hammering, it's whoever gets up there first, whoever grows up first wins. And this is a little bit of a challenge to that. Again, you may have these mother trees, these hub trees, that while they're shading out the smaller saplings, at the same time they're sending them carbon, helping them along as they grow. This photo, sort of unrelated, but this is a photo demonstrating canopy shyness, a phenomenon among certain trees where they will not grow into each other's canopies. You may have seen photos of this before. We think it may have to do with they don't want to touch each other so they don't spread certain pathogens, but it always, makes a very pretty photo as well. So now I'm going to talk about Peter Volkman. Some of you may have read this book, you may have heard of this book, The Hidden Life of Trees. So Peter originally was a logger in Germany. He's German. And he did a lot of work around the Hummel forest in Germany, which is a lot of beech trees traditionally grew there. And as logging occurred, you would replant these areas with more of a cash crop of what trees you would want. Sort of removing the diversity and coming back in with, okay, well, what will make the most money? And over time, he became sort of disenchanted with this. He hated this idea of, well, I'm marking the trees that are going to be removed. We never see them again. And he sort of has combined in this book his own observations about the forest, along with research that has been going on. He mentions Dr. Simard, he mentions other researchers. Over time, he got to the point where he said, I no longer want to be a logger. I want to maintain this one section of the forest. So he went to his local government and he convinced them to set aside this section of the Hummel forest as a reserve. And he manages it. There is no logging, of course. The way they pay for this, interesting little aside, is the money is generated from people donating in order to spread their ashes in the forest. There are no gravestones in this forest, but there are, from the looks of it, some tags on the trees that indicate, when people have, scattered ashes there. And so again, they set it away from development, and this is what he does now. He is in this one forest, observing the relationships among the trees, and again, his book goes into a great deal of detail about that. There is some, as I said, some anthropomorphizing in the book. Again, if you're living this all the time, you can generally start to do that over time. So he does sort of romanticize the relationships among them, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a very interesting book. I recommend you take a look at it. He does, again, go back to other researchers that have been working alongside him. One of the first things he goes over in the book, I think in the first few pages, is walking around in his forest and coming across what he thought was a rock. And he dug down a little bit and he found it was actually a very, very old tree stump, maybe 400, 500 years old, of a beech tree. And as he dug down, he noticed that it had a green tint to it. Now, we often think of chlorophyll only being in leaves, but chlorophyll also exists in the trunk of a tree. And he realized that that tree was actually still alive. This is not a photo of that tree, but the one that he found was still alive. And as he looked around the base of it, he noticed that this beech tree had its roots connected to other beech trees. And, it wasn't producing enough of its own carbon to stay alive. You wouldn't expect that. But the other trees were actually providing this tree with carbohydrates, possibly with water as well. Very fascinating thing that this tree stump is being kept alive by its neighbors. And so that affected him a lot. And I think maybe that encouraged him to look into some of the research about, are the trees caring for one another? Are they letting each other know when they're in trouble? One thing I'd like to do as an aside is tell you that tree growth and how they allocate their energy is controlled by a number of different things. Predominantly hormones, auxin, ethylene, etc. And also tree growth is controlled by outside stimuli, sunlight, the availability of it, nutrient availability, gravity. And generally, throughout a tree's life and throughout its growing season, what it does is controlled by these hormones, these chemicals. The one I'd like to focus on is ethylene. Ethylene is generally a gas. Typically, most people know ethylene as a product that we use. Ethylene is responsible for ripening in fruit. And so if you needed to rapidly or evenly ripen a fruit crop, so it could go to the grocery store, you expose it to ethylene gas. This is a very common produce technique. And ethylene doesn't only cause things to ripen, it can cause changes in plant structure. It can lead toward leaf drop as we go into the fall. It has a number of different uses. One thing that researchers found, and Peter Volkman talks about, is the relationship between acacia trees and giraffes in Africa. Giraffes typically browse on acacia trees. And what they found is as a giraffe starts to munch on the leaves, the tree begins to release ethylene. And the tree that's being browsed itself will begin to generate tannins and other bitter compounds to make itself not taste as well. It doesn't do this instantly, it's a fairly slow process, but eventually that tree becomes unpalatable to whatever's eating it. Well, the thing that was interesting in that research was as that ethylene gas was being emitted, other trees that were not being eaten by giraffes were beginning to put tannins into their leaves. They were beginning to put these bitter compounds. And so that raises the question, is the tree warning its neighbors, just so you know, giraffes are here, start making yourself taste bad? You know, that is an interesting question. Is that in of itself communication? Is the tree warning the other trees nearby? Or is it simply emitting chemicals that they can react to? That's an important question. And again, I'm not going to tell you, you know, it's one way or the other. It could be a bit of both. Trees do emit a number of chemicals when they're under stress. A very common outcome of that is borers and other insects are drawn to those chemicals that the tree emits. It generally lets them know, hey, this tree is stressed. It probably doesn't have as many defensive compounds. It might be easier to get into this tree to eat, to feed on it without having issues. So that's another question. Is the tree communicating, hey, I'm weak, come get me? You know, that's another question. Probably not, but you know, it's a good question. Is it communication at that point? Or is it, you know, something that evolution has caused in these trees to just emit that and their neighbors have learned to react to it? It's a good question. Another thing I'd like to talk about is allele chemicals, which I can almost never pronounce correctly. If we're talking about competition among plants, which does exist, allele chemicals are chemicals that the plant produces to suppress the growth of other competitors. The most well-known version of this is on the left, you have a black walnut tree, common in our area. On the right, you have a tomato crop. The botanical name, the scientific name for black walnut is Juglans nigra. And from that, we get the name juglone. Juglone is an allele chemical. Pretty well known. If you have a black walnut in your front yard, you are probably not going to be able to grow tomatoes. They're very reactive to it. The root system of the black walnut secretes this into the ground. Almost every part of this tree, if it lands in the ground, will eventually secrete this chemical to outcompete the neighbors. So there are chemical ways that they try and discourage each other along with helping each other. But again, go back to, well, what is the natural ecology? What is the natural system? Would a black walnut react that way to a tree that it grew up alongside in terms of evolution? That's a good question. Maybe you would have that instead of these chemicals, maybe you would have the defensive compounds or the carbon sharing that would occur. Maybe you do get communication when it's in a more natural ecology. And then you have to think, well, how does that impact our own landscape? We generally put plants together that in the native environment aren't used to one another. So are we discouraging communication and instead encouraging these allele chemicals? It really can be a bit of a rabbit hole if you go down into it. This is just a photo of mycelium of mycorrhizae, that have attached to these tree roots. And it really can give you something to think about. Some other things I'd like to point out is in Dr. Simard's research, she found those mother trees I had mentioned were actually inoculating the saplings around them with this mycorrhizae. They were making sure that they had this on them. So again, that goes back to the question of, are they helping these other trees out? Are they shepherding them through life? I encourage you to take a look at the Mother Tree Project's website and look over some of their research. It's very interesting. Now, how does this impact? I've touched on it a little bit. Certainly forestry and logging practices, if there are these hub trees that are responsible for the overall health of the forest they're in, well, certainly you don't want to clear cut these, remove them all, just so you can replace them with a higher cash crop of trees. Is it possible you're wiping out, that whole section of the forest because you took out these hub trees? That's an interesting question. If you're looking at sustainable logging practices, we do move away from clear cutting whole areas, but do we have to do more than that? Do we have to be more selective in what we're looking at? Landscape and arboriculture practices, of course. I'm an arborist. We look at individual trees, or if we're urban foresters, we look at them in the built environment. Well, then we have to think, do we have these situations where they're going to be stressed in terms of health, just because we've sort of eliminated this mycorrhizal network because of how we build buildings, change the grade, bring in topsoil, compact, put over organic matter, and then put in, what plants we think will look nice. Is it possible we need to look more at these relationship among trees to overall improve their health? And of course, climate change and climate change remediation, are a big part of this. We're looking at carbon sequestration among healthy forests. We're looking at, how do forests recover from wildfires? How do they recover from invasions of certain pests, pine bark beetles, things like that? And, is it having those hub trees, those mother trees, help the whole forest get through a situation like that? Again, relatively speaking, the research is pretty young. It gives you a lot of interesting and exciting, outcomes as a result of this. So that's the end of my talk. So I'm happy to take some questions. Meg may have already been fielding some questions in the chat box. I will caution you, there's a certain amount of details in the research itself, the methodology, that I won't be able to go into simply because I haven't read all the journal articles. But some general questions, I'll see what I can do for that. And thank you very much for listening to this talk. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen if it will let me.
Richard, thank you so much for that. There was one question in the chat during the talk from Kate McLinn. Aren't tree mycorrhizal relationships species specific? And I think that was answered in the talk, but Kate, if you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And anyone else who has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. I'll read it out and see if we can't get an answer for you.
Looking over what's in the chat, that is interesting, what you talk about, not enjoying the Overstory because there was some, some cruelty to the trees. And that is, there is a certain amount of, if they are communicating with one another, Pierre Volkman was a logger and he isn't anymore. It causes some interesting questions.
Richard, no one has any questions. You answered everything perfectly. No one has any follow-up.
That's the trick. You take everyone so far out of depth that you don't have to worry about questions. But again, I encourage you, please take a look at the TED Talks, take a look at the Mother Tree Project. There may be things that I neglected to touch on. This is something that's becoming interesting. Forgive me, not interesting, something that's sort of being part of the public conversation. I'll give you an example. My two young kids were watching the remake of the Magic School Bus, and one of the episodes talks about trees and communication. I'm probably not as interesting as an episode of the Magic School Bus, but hopefully you got some entertainment out of it.
George had a question. Some trees don't depend on mycorrhizae. Do they still communicate?
Well, you do have root crafts still. I'd have to take a look at the research of, well, is there a trackable amount of carbon movement among trees when there isn't a mycorrhizal relationship? That is a very good question. You would expect that there is some transfer, but, do you get the same amount of, defensive compounds and other chemicals shared when there isn't a mycorrhizal relationship? That is a very good question. I honestly don't know the answer to it myself. One thing I will say is that, mycorrhizae, it is a symbiotic relationship, but sometimes they have a certain amount of control over how much nutrients they share with the tree. Some research has found that they almost have kind of an on-off switch when it comes to sharing nitrogen, where they say, okay, that's enough, I'm holding on to this for now.
Oh, yes, please unmute yourself if you have any crazy theories or speculation, or non-crazy ones as well. From Anne, you said some have a parasitic relationship. What happens there?
Well, as I said, there is some research indicating that mycorrhizae, have some control over how much nutrients they share. Well, in that situation, they have, for lack of a better word, infected or inoculated. They've attached themselves to the root of this tree, and as a result, are able to draw carbon away from its sugars, carbohydrates. And so there does seem to be a range in terms of how helpful they want to be. But there are a few of them that are more on the parasitic side instead of mutually beneficial. And maybe there is some impact on that based on, what the current climate is in the area they're in. If there isn't a lot of nitrogen in the soil, maybe the mycorrhizae hold on to more of it, while still helping themselves to some carbon from the tree.
From Mary, I think it is interesting that the three researchers who you mentioned were all women. I think it is striking that they challenged the view of competition and offered one that was related to cooperation. I also think that is interesting. I also strive in my work to be referred to as the next Canopy Meg, perhaps.
Yes, I'm glad that you all picked up on that as well. Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting, and there is a fair amount of pushback on this research as well. I mean, you have to understand that there is, you probably already understand, there's a lot of money involved with, commercial logging practices. So there is going to be some pushback, and I'm sure there is, some counter research as well. But it is very interesting that they've, brought out this more cooperative model. I see there's a question about mushrooms after the rain. Generally, after a summer rainstorm, you do start to see the fungal fruiting bodies pop up all over the place. They are influenced by the rain. If you have a tree that you are concerned about, after a rainstorm, I'd recommend going out and taking a look at it, not while it's storming. But after these summer storms, take a look and see if fruiting bodies are coming out of the trunk or around the root flares. That can give you an idea of, a saprophyte, a fungus feeding on decaying wood. So that's one of the warning signs of the tree potentially under structural stress.
Josh's question is, can you speak more about trees in urban spaces, how we cohabitate with them and how they are different from forest trees? So that, in my opinion, is a whole other talk that we could come back for. Richard did touch on it some in his talk about the disturbing the soils with our construction. Richard, can you maybe give like the top 3 notes you would have about that?
Sure, and Peter Volkman touches on this. One of the main things that we do in a landscape with trees is we create what foresters would call a wolf tree. We allow the tree to have, generally not as much competition. We try to not plant trees very close to one another. Whereas in the forest, they generally are much closer to one another. Now, some of the reasons we do that are to avoid structural issues or to allow for infrastructure, but that is one of the big differences. Of course, another, we touched on it, the levels of that mycorrhizal mycelium is much, much lower in our soil. If typical steps of building a building are, excavating, removing some horizons of soil, coming back in with topsoil, and then compacting. Compacting is very critical when you're trying to set a foundation. You go to 85, 95% compaction. Well, the mycelium is going to really struggle to get into a built environment. But out in the forest, you have, and Dr. Simard talks about this, miles and miles of mycelium in that one small square foot that you probably don't have in our built environment. Can you inoculate them? That's something I'd be very curious about. Can you effectively inoculate the soil, without causing another completely different issue? So those are some of the main ones.
And I see that Patricia did list the link to Richard's past talk on urban tree care in the chat if anyone would want to go onto YouTube and watch that as well. Even though I am a certified arborist, I do learn things every time I listen to Richard talk. So I highly recommend that you take a look at that. Okay. Would you expect to find communication between trees in our stressed urban environment?
Well, in ideal soil conditions, we expect a tree root system to go 1.5, 2 times the distance of the canopy spread. We normally don't have that in the built environment. So I'm sure there is not as much, well, certainly not as much root grafts among trees, and they probably do not have as much of this connecting through mycorrhizal mycelium as a result as well. Again, heavily compacted soils are very difficult for tree roots to get into, but they are part of the process to build infrastructure. And so you do have that conflict there. So yeah, along with many other tree issues, plant issues, water issues that can come in from overdevelopment, I'm sure we are probably losing enough of this mycorrhizal network that if it is playing this role in communication, yeah, we're probably not getting that.
All right, Richard, do you know the difference between mycorrhizae and mycelium?
So mycelium is simply the collection of all of the, and I'm going to mispronounce it, hyphae. These are all the little threads that make up the majority of a fungus's biomass. You know, we see the mushrooms, that's a very small part of the fungus. The hyphae, the mycelium, is all of those little threads. Mycorrhizae simply means root fungus. That's all that word means. Whereas mycelium is all of those little threads connected to one another. I know I've probably said them both so many times, it's easy to mix them up.
I think you nailed the pronunciation on that. All right, from Kate, any suggestions on how to teach the benefits of fungi? I have found that many of my young students were taught to regard mushrooms as bad and would destroy them. Naturally, we don't want kids eating random mushrooms, but how do we change our thinking? And this is something that I have thought about a lot as well. Richard and I both have young children, and we are doing our best to get them outside and get them learning about the outdoor world. And there are a lot of schools that are now incorporating outdoor learning into their curriculum because of, unfortunately, the pandemic. But that's one of the little silver linings of the pandemic, is that we are getting outside more, hopefully. But I do see this in some of my work as well. And I think it is something that we are already doing by becoming master gardeners and teaching our skills to the next generation. Richard, any follow-up on my excellent answer there?
No, that was an excellent answer. My main recommendation was, you know, there are, and I need to take one myself, there are courses in mycology, in the study of fungus, and I think a lot of it comes down to identification. Yes, there are mushrooms that are, you know, potentially fatal if ingested. There are mushrooms that are saprophytes that indicate a problem going on with a tree. There are also mushrooms like Lucinum that are mycorrhizal, and really teaching people how to differentiate between them can be very helpful. I'd recommend using the iNaturalist phone application or other identifying applications. You know, if you're unsure as to what a mushroom is, maybe it can help you get a better idea of what it might be. So I think that's been a nice benefit we've had with the increase in phone apps available. You know, they're really trying to make it easier for the you know, the layperson to identify plants and mushrooms and animals.
Maybe introducing them to mushrooms we can eat.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, can street trees communicate with other trees given that they are caged by curbs, sidewalks, etc.?
Well, one of the big problems with street trees and trees in the built environment is lack of sufficient root space. You know, we unfortunately call them tree coffins when trees are planted along the road a lot of time. If enough attention hasn't gone into providing sufficient soil volume and quality soil, you know, a lot of these issues sort of self-replicate because you get a tree in an area that is too restrictive for it. It starts to damage the infrastructure around it by lifting up sidewalk pavements and growing into areas we don't want it to go. Then you have to repair that infrastructure, which damages the tree's root system, which can lead to the tree falling over. So you do have this sort of combative issue a lot of times with street trees. And because they have, you know, if they're planted in concrete planters, certainly they're, you know, they'll try and eventually break out of that and find ways around. But yeah, they you know, may not be able to have these networks in place. There are, you know, there are researchers, there are landscape architects, there are practitioners who try and, you know, really change how we plant street trees and really give us, you know, what they really need. So there is some hope in that. That's a very good question about biophilic irrigation. You know, I will tell you, I have actually not heard that term before, so I have some homework for tonight. Um, that would make sense if you are looking at the sharing of water among trees. Certainly that I would expect it to play a role in that. You know, often we think about trees and, you know, turf grass competing with one another. And so it's easy to have that in our mindset, that same competition for water. But I will have to look that up myself. That's interesting. I've honestly not heard that term before.
Well, I think, does anybody have any last questions? It's about 3 minutes to 7. I feel maybe we can start wrapping up. What do you think, Meg and Richard? Any final thoughts?
Great. I love the discussion. I liked all the questions. Thank you for being a part of our talk today.
Yes, thank you all very much. And again, you know, take a look at some of those TED Talks. They are very inspiring, I think. And thank you again.
Richard, Meg, would you guys be able to send me the links to the TED Talks so that I can share them in my next week's email?
Certainly.
Sure. Yep.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and have a wonderful night. Gail, that's such a little cutie you have there. Bye, everybody. Have a great night.